Well, I'm joined by three very special guests today, each of whom has a different and unique connection to the Korean War. First is Don Taylor, a United States Marine, a Korean War veteran, and current commander of the Korean War Veterans Association of Arizona. So welcome, Don.
Thank you.
Also with us is Joel Stemple. Joel is a United States Army veteran, and although not a Korean War veteran himself, he does volunteer his time with the Korean War Veterans Association and is the current commander of the General Brad Smith Ray Harvey chapter of the Korean War Veterans Association. Joel, welcome.
Thank you.
And also with us is Susan Key, a Korean-American writer and historian who has a deep personal connection to the Korean War and with our Korean War veterans, and spends a lot of her time honoring them. So thank you for being with us,
Thank
Susan.
you for having me.
Don, I'd like to start with you and just ask you to tell us about your Korean War experience.
I was in Korea at age 20. Actually, I was worked out of Seoul, Korea, but I flew, I should say that I was an aircraft mechanic, and I flew all over Korea, the K sites at that time in a four-motored transport. We were actually in a support function. We supplied our troops. We hauled most everything. However, it was mostly troops. We did make contact with, for example, we flew mail runs to Haneda in Tokyo, and at the same time, we took care of our maintenance basically out of Seoul.
When you signed up for the Marines, is that what you expected to do? Is that where you expected to go?
No, absolutely not. When I wanted to be a Marine since I was 11 years old, and I soon found out that they put you where they want you. That was the last thing in the world that I wanted to have anything to do with aviation. Later on, I went into security. However, that was for a short time period.
When you look back on it now, how do you characterize your experience, or what do you think about when you look back on your time with the Marines in Korea?
Well, I think that I did the right thing, or perhaps they did the right thing, because why walk when you can ride? So, to me, that was very satisfying. At least I got to be a Marine. Maybe it wasn't what I wanted to be, but I did come home, and that was the main thing.
And what was it like returning home at that time?
I was overseas we didn't call it deployed in those days. I was overseas for 20 months and 3 days. It was surreal. I flew from San Francisco to Chicago, and I really didn't know what to do. It was totally different. But soon I realized I was home, and it didn't take long actually, I ended up being stationed at Great Lakes, and 40 days later, I exited the Marine Corps to civilian life, and very happy to be here.
And at what point in your life afterward did you become involved with the Korean War Veterans Association and think about how important it was to honor those who had served in Korea, such as yourself?
Well, I actually joined other VSOs, Veteran Service Organizations, before. I was both Veterans Foreign Wars and American Legion prior to. The problem with the Korean War veterans at that time, it was the best kept secret that I'd ever see. I actually found out about it by accident. And I have been a member, I think, since 2001. However, I had joined the other VSOs long before.
Susan, I'd like to turn to you, and you have a very deep personal connection to the Korean War. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I guess simply put, I wouldn't be here without veterans like Mr. Taylor. He's the one who went to Korea to save my family from communism. And if not for our Korean War veterans, there's no way that any of us Koreans who live in freedom from North Korea's communist regime could be here. So I owe my life and my freedoms to all of our Korean War veterans and all those who never came home, the fallen heroes and those who are still missing from the Korean War. So to me, it's a very personal connection because every day I realize I am alive and free because of our Korean War veterans. My mom was about 9 years old, and my dad was about 17 when the war started. So the war is not too far from my understanding of what happened in my birth country. I was born 13 years after the war, and Korea was still very poor in the 60s. So the war was always talked about in my family, and their stories have been handed down to me, and we've never forgotten that we were saved from such an evil and tyrannical regime that still exists today in North Korea. So if Americans and other United Nations countries had not come to save us, I know that South Korea would have been swallowed by North Korean communist regime, and I wouldn't be standing here or sitting here with you today. So I am so devoted to looking for veterans to thank, because I think that it's never too late to thank them. And I know that the Korean War is always talked about as the forgotten war. And I don't like hearing that, because for our family and all the veterans who fought and the families who lost loved ones in the Korean War, it's never going to be forgotten. So, so it is my passion now to make sure that people understand the legacy of our Korean War veterans, that they have given freedom to millions of Koreans like me. And so I will keep telling that story until everyone really understands the gravity of what our Korean War veterans have done. They saved a country and a people from communism.
And you share their stories, their personal stories.
Yes. So,
via
I'm
your
sorry,
Facebook
I didn't answer
page.
that question. So when I started meeting the veterans, they started telling me their stories and showing me photos of Korea and telling me places I never even heard of in Korea. And I thought, wow, they're the best Korean War history teachers. So I started just sitting down with them and taping their interview and interviewing them, asking them their stories, and they would bring out maps and photos and really educate me. And so everything that I have learned, I've started to put on Facebook, on social media, because I wanted to share what I have received from the veterans and to educate the public about the Korean War and their legacy. So it's become a really exciting journey that I never thought I would be taking. And to be even next to Mr. Taylor and to be able to give him a call and just talk to him as someone of a friend is really amazing, because he's a hero. And I know so many heroes in my life, and I'm so grateful for this journey that I did not plan on, that God led me to.
Well, it's great to see, and we really appreciate the work you're doing there. I'd like to talk to you, Joel, a little bit, as someone who is not yourself a Korean War veteran. You also have a personal connection, and you told me a story earlier of kind of when that connection began.
Right. I grew up in Virginia, and on June 25th, 1950, I was not quite eight years old, and I was driving with my dad, and we listened to the radio, and President Truman came on and said that North Korea invaded South Korea, and it was a very serious situation. So I asked my dad, I said, "Where's Korea?" He says, "It's in Asia, I think." And I said, "Well," and so we talked a little bit, and so when I got home, I used an encyclopedia, which we not used to seeing anymore, and I looked up Korea, and I was interested in it, and I started following it. And my dad told me, he said, when I was 7 years old, he said, you ought to start reading the newspaper. I never thought about it, so I started reading the newspaper, and I followed the Korean War that way, and all the way through, and that's how I learned about it.
And you subsequently served in the Army yourself
Right.
in the 60s.
In the 60s, I was in Germany.
And do you think that your experience as a young boy with the Korean War beginning, do you think that maybe planted the seed for you wanting to serve in the Army?
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to be a Marine, but I knew that wasn't going to happen because I wore glasses, and at that time the Marines didn't take people with glasses. So I went into college, and my dad told me, he says, always better to go in as an officer. And so I joined ROTC, and I got commissioned when I graduated in 1963, and I served in Germany for 2 years in the Quartermaster Corps.
And so tell us how you came to be a member of the Korean War Veterans Association?
That's interesting. One of my friends is a Korean War veteran, and he said, "Would you go with me?" He was kind of shy. I'm going on this thing, and I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll go." So I went, and it was very, very welcoming and very nice. And I got up and I said, "You probably have to." When I introduced myself, I said, "I'll have to tell you I was an officer," and all the guys looked at me. And but anyway, and then it was a lot of camaraderie, a lot of history. People were very, very nice, and they accepted me. And then about 2 years after I went there, and I joined it, and I paid my dues, and the commander left. And so they asked me if I wanted to be the commander. And the reason that they did is I'm about 10 years younger than most of the others in there, and no one wanted it. So I did. I took over as commander, and I think I've been doing it for 4 years. And it's been very satisfying. The people that I've known and I've worked with are just absolutely terrific, and just really, really nice people.
Well, I think it's incredibly important for people to share those stories, and I think it's great that you are helping a group of them meet and do that. Don, I want to turn back to you. Do you have opportunities now to reflect back, hearing a personal story like Susan's, to really kind of reflect back on the legacy of yourself and the others in the United States Armed Services who served in Korea? Do you think about what that really means?
Absolutely. The South Korean people they actually can't do enough for us. They are so appreciative of what we did at that time. And you have to be a Korean veteran to realize exactly how much they do for us. And we thank you, Susan. And you know, every Korean veteran that we talk to says the same thing about South Korea. We did the right thing, and of course, I'm not able right now at my age, but I'd do it again.
Well, Susan, he talked about that legacy, and it's been a long time ago. How do you think people living in America now understand it, or do they understand it?
I think most people don't have any clue about the Korean War. All they know is about World War II and Vietnam, and that's very little. And schools right now, I think, are teaching very little about history as it is with military history. So Korea sits right in the middle of World War II and Vietnam, and it's always been in the shadows. And I think that's a primary reason why it's forgotten. So that is why, one of the reasons why I decided to go on social media to reach a lot of people with Korean War history from the perspective of the veterans that I meet and interview, and then from the perspective of Korean person who is here testifying to what they gave us, our freedoms. So I felt it was very important to put the voice of the Korean people with gratitude and honor for our American veterans.
Certainly, we've really, I think, just brushed the surface of an incredible topic, and you touched on the thousands and thousands and thousands of stories there are that you're helping to tell. This question is really for all three of you, but what would you ask people who see this to do to honor those who served in the Korean War?
It is the people who have been saved that need to thank our veterans. And to me, that's just basic. That is just basic, and that's such a small thing we're doing. But I think that's an important thing, is to learn the stories of the veterans. So I think you asked, well, what can the public do? I would say develop a curiosity about the Korean War. Go find Korean War veterans, ask them their stories, capture their stories. If you have a Korean War veteran in your family, an uncle or father, please ask them, because I know our Korean War veterans have long kept their mouth closed about the war. But I think part of it is because they don't see that anyone is interested.
Susan, can you tell us the
Yes.
name of your Facebook page so people could go and
Yes.
read some of these stories?
Yes, my Facebook page is Susan Key Honoring Korean War Veterans.
And we'll share that on the screen for
Thank
our
you so
viewers as
much.
well. But we also release this as a podcast, so for those who are listening in their cars or while they're working around the house, please give that page a visit. I just want to thank each of you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we hope that that this gives a little bit more attention to a group of very, very worthy veterans, Don and your colleagues who served in the Korean War. So thank you for your service, and thank you, each of you, for what you're doing to honor our Korean War veterans.